Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Chapter 5.
In every country, the wealth that is in it has a natural tendency to accumulate in the hands of certain individuals, whether the laws of the society do or do not favor that accumulation. Although it has been observed in a former chapter that wealth follows industry and flies from the son of the affluent citizen to the poor country boy, yet that is only the case with wealth, the possessor of which requires industry to keep it. For where wealth has been obtained, so as to be in the form of land or money at interest, this is no longer the case. In America, and in countries that are new, or in those of which the inhabitants have been sufficiently hardy and rash to overturn every ancient institution, precautions have been taken against the accumulation of too much wealth in the hands of one person, or at least to discourage and counteract it. But in old nations, where we do not choose to run such risks, the case is different. The natural vanity of raising a family, the means that a rich man has to accumulate, the natural chance of wealth accumulating by marriages, and many other circumstances operate in favor of all those rich men who are freed from risk and independent of industry. In some cases, extravagance dissipates wealth, but the laws favor accumulation of landed property and counteract extravagance. The advantages are in favor of all the wealthy in general, and the consequence is that from the first origin of any particular order of things, till some convulsion takes place, the division of property becomes more and more unequal. Far from counteracting this by the laws of the land, in all those countries, the governments of which took strength during this feudal system, there are regulations leading greatly to accelerate the progress. The law of primogeniture has this effect, and the law of entails, both immoral and impolitic in its operation, has a still greater tendency. These laws only extend to agricultural property, but commerce, which at first tends to disseminate wealth, in the end has the same effect of accumulating it in private hands. Industry, art, and intelligence are, in the early ages, the spring of commerce. But as machinery and capital become necessary, a set of persons rise up who engross all the great profits and amass immense fortunes. The consequence of great fortunes and the unequal division of property are that the lower ranks, though expensively maintained, become degraded, disorderly, and uncomfortable, while the middling classes disappear by degrees. Discontent pervades the great mass of the people, and the supporters of the government, though powerful, are too few in number and too inefficient in character to preserve it from ruin. The proprietors of land or money should never be so far raised above the ordinary class of the people as to be totally ignorant of their manner of feeling and existing, or to lose sight of the connection between industry and prosperity, for whenever they do, the industrious are oppressed and wealth vanishes. It requires not much knowledge and little love of justice to see that there must be gradations in society which, instead of diminishing, increase the general happiness of mankind. But when we find that the chance of being born half an hour sooner or later makes one man the proprietor of 50,000 acres and another little better than a beggar, when we consider that, by means of industry, he never may be able to purchase a garden to grow cabbages for his family, it loosens our attachment to the order of things we see before us. It hurts our ideas of moral equity. A man of reflection wishes the evil to be silently counteracted, and if he is violent and has any disposition to try a change, it furnishes him with arguments and abettors. When the Romans, with whose history we are tolerably well acquainted, grew rich, the division of property became very unequal, and the attachment of the people for their government declined. The middle classes lost their importance, and the lower orders of free citizens became a mere rabble. When Rome was poor, the people did not cry for bread, but when the brick buildings were turned into marble palaces, when a lamprey was sold for £56, the people became a degraded populace, not much better or less disorderly than the Lazzaroni of Naples. A donation of corn was a bribe to a Roman citizen, though there is not, perhaps, an order of peasantry in the most remote corner of Europe who would consider such a donation in ordinary times as an object either worthy of clamor or deserving of thanks. The Romans, at the time when Cincinnatus held the plow, and the conquerors of nations roasted their own turnips, would have thought themselves degraded by eating bread obtained by such means. But it was different with the Romans after they had conquered the world. In a more recent example, we may trace a similar effect arising from a cause not very different. The unequal division of property in France was one of the chief causes of the Revolution, the intention of which was to overturn the then existing order of things. The ignorance of the great proprietors concerning of their true interests and the smallness of their numbers disabled them from protecting themselves. The middle orders were discontented and wished for a change, and the lower orders were so degraded that, at the first signal, they became as mutinous and as mean as the plebeians at Rome in the days of its splendor. That this was not alone owing to the unequal division of property is certain. There were other causes, but that was a principal one. As a proof that this was so in England, where property is more equally divided than it was in France, the common people are more attached to government and of a different spirit, though they are changing since the late great influx of wealth into this country, and since difficulties which have accumulated on the heads of the middle orders, while those who have large fortunes feel a greater facility of augmenting them than at any former period. In those parts of this country where wealth has made the least progress, the character of the people supports itself the best amongst the lower classes, and the inverse progress of that character and of the acquisition of wealth is sufficiently striking to be noticed by one who is neither a very near nor a very nice observer. Discontent and envy arise from comparison, and where they become prevalent, society can never stand long. They are enemies to fair industry. Whatever may have been the delusive theories into which ill-intentioned, designing, and subtile men have sometimes deluded the great mass of the people, they have never been successful, except when they could fight under the appearance of justice and thereby create discontent. The unequal division of property has frequently served them in this case, while it increased the ignorance and diminished the number of the enemies they had to encounter. As this evil has arisen to a greater height in countries which have had less wealth in the aggregate than England, it is not the most dangerous thing we have to encounter, but, as the tendency to it increases very rapidly of late years, we must, by no means, overlook it. A future chapter will be dedicated to the purpose of inquiring how this may be counteracted in some cases, in others modified and disguised, so as to prevent, in some degree, the evil effects that naturally arise from it. Of all the ways in which property accumulates in particular hands, the most dangerous is landed property, not only on account of entails and the law of primogeniture, which attach to land alone, but because it is the property the most easily retained, the least liable to be alienated, and the only one that augments in value in a state that is growing rich. An estate in land augments in value without augmenting in extent when a country becomes richer. A fortune, lent at interest, diminishes as the value of money sinks. A fortune engaged in trade is liable to risks and requires industry to preserve it. But industry, it has been observed, never is to be found for any great length of time in any single line of men. Consequently, there are few great moneyed men, except such as have acquired their own fortunes, and those can never be very numerous nor overgrown. Besides our having facts to furnish proofs that there are no very great fortunes except landed fortunes, it can scarcely have escaped the notice of any one that no other gives such umbrage or shows the inferiority men who have none so much. That there is a perpetual tendency to the accumulation of property in the hands of individuals is certain, for amongst the nations of Europe, those who are the most ancient exhibit the most striking contrasts of poverty and riches. Nations obtaining wealth by commerce are less liable to this danger than any others. At least we are led to believe so, from the present situation of things. We are, perhaps, however, not altogether right in the conclusion. In France there were, and in Germany, Russia, and Poland, there are some immense fortunes, though general wealth is not nearly equal to that of England. So much for a comparison between nations of the present day. Again, it is certain there were some fortunes in England in the times of the Plantagenets and Tudors, much greater than any of the present times. England was not then near so wealthy as it is now, and had very little commerce. It would then appear that whether we compare England with what it was before it became a wealthy and commercial nation, or with other nations at the present time which are not wealthy, commerce and riches appear to have operated in dividing riches and making that division more equal, rather than in rendering their accumulation great in particular hands and their distribution unequal. Before we are too positive about the cause, though we admit this effect, let us inquire whether there are not some other circumstances that are peculiar to the present situation of England that may, if not wholly, at least in part, account for it. The form of government in England is different from that of any of those countries. It is also different in its nature, though not in its form, from what it was under the Plantagenets and Tudors. Court favor cannot enrich a family in this country, and the operation of the law is tolerably equal. As neither protection nor rank in this country raise a man above the rest of society, so the richest subject is obliged to obtain by his expenditure that consideration which he would obtain by other means under another form of government, and he is as much compelled to pay his debts as any other man. It is not, however, the great wealth of one individual, or even of a few individuals, that is an object of consideration. It will be found that the great number of persons who live upon revenues sufficiently abundant to exempt them from care and attention and to enable them to injure the manners of the people, being above the necessity of economy, feeling none of its wants, and contributing nothing by their own exertion to its wealth or strength, is a very great evil, and one that tends constantly to increase. But if this progress goes on while a nation is acquiring wealth, how much faster does it not proceed when it approaches towards its decline? It is, then, indeed, that the extremes of poverty and riches are to be seen in the most striking degree. The higher classes can never be made to contribute their share towards the prosperity of a state. Where there are no middling classes to connect the higher and lower orders, and to protect the lower orders from the power of the higher, a state must gradually decline. It is in the middling classes that the freedom, the intelligence, and the industry of a country reside. The higher class may be very intelligent, but can never be very numerous. And being above the feeling of want, except in a few instances, where nature has endowed the wealthy with innate good qualities, there is nothing to be expected or obtained of them towards the general good. From the working and laborious classes, again, little is to be expected. They fill the part assigned to them when they perform their duty to themselves and families, and they have neither leisure nor other means of contributing to general prosperity as public men. They, indeed, pay more than their share of taxes in almost every country, but they cannot directly, even by election, participate in the government of the country. If any number of persons engross the whole of the lands of a nation, then the laborers that live on those lands must be in a degraded situation. They then become less sound and less important members of the state than they would otherwise be. Necessity does not act with that favorable impulse on people, where property is very unequally divided, that it does where the gradation from the state of poverty to that of riches is more regular. As the action of the body is brought on by the effect produced on the mind, and as there is no hope of obtaining wealth where it appears very unequally divided, so also there is no exertion where there is no hope. Where there is no regular gradation of rank and division of property, emulation, which is the spur to action, when absolute necessity ceases to operate, is entirely destroyed. Thus the lower classes become degraded and discouraged, as is universally found to be the case in nations that have passed their meridian, the contrary being as regularly and constantly the case with rising nations. Besides the degradation and listlessness occasioned in the lower ranks, by an unequal distribution of property, the most agreeable and the strongest bond of society is thereby broken, the bond that consists in the attachment of the inferior classes to those immediately above them. Where the distance is great, there is but little connection, and that connection is merely founded upon conveniency, not on a similarity of feeling or an occasional interchange of good actions or mutual services. By this means, the whole society becomes, as it were, disjointed. And if the chain is not entirely broken, it has at least lost that strength and pliability that is necessary, either for the raising a nation to greatness or supporting it after it has risen to a superior degree of rank or power. Amongst the causes of the decline of wealthy nations, this then is one. The great lose sight of the origin of their wealth and cease to consider that all wealth originates in labor, and that, therefore, the industrious and productive classes are the sinews of riches and power. The French nation, to which we have had occasion to allude already, was in this situation before the Revolution. Rome was so likewise before its fall. We are not, however, to expect to find this as a principal cause in the fall of all nations. Many of them fell from exterior and not interior causes. Venice, Genoa, and all the places that flourished in the Middle Ages fell from other causes. Whatever their internal energy might have been, their fate could not have been altered, nor their fall prevented. The case is different with nations of which the extent is sufficiently great to protect them against the attacks of their enemies, and where the local situation is such as to secure them from a change taking place in the channels of commerce, a cause of decline which is not to be resisted by any power inherent in a nation itself. In Spain and Portugal, the internal causes are the preponderating ones, and, in some measure, though not altogether so, in Holland. If England should ever fall, internal causes must have a great share in the catastrophe. In this inquiry, then, we must consider the interior state of the country as of great importance. When property is very unequally divided, the moneyed capital of a nation, upon the employment of which, next to its industry, its wealth or revenue depend, begins to be applied less advantageously. A preference is given to employments, by which money is got with most ease and certainty, though in less quantity. A preference also is given to lines of business that are reckoned the most noble and independent. Manufacturers aspire to become merchants, and merchants to become mere lenders of money or agents. The detail is done by brokers, by men who take the trouble and understand the nature of the particular branches they undertake, but who furnish no capital. The Dutch were the greatest example of this. Independent of those great political events, which have, as it were, completed the ruin of their country, they had long ceased to give that great encouragement to manufactures, which had at first raised them to wealth and power in so surprising a manner. They had, in the latter times, become agents for others rather than merchants on their own account, so that the capital, which at one time brought in probably 20 or 25% annually, and which had, even at a late period, produced 10 or 15, was employed in a way that scarcely produced 3. If it were possible to employ large capitals with as much advantage, and to make them set in motion and maintain as much industry as small ones are made to do, there would scarcely be any limit to the accumulation of money in a country. But a vast variety of causes operate on preventing this. Whatever, therefore, tends to accumulate the capital of a nation in a few hands, thereby depriving the many, not only increases luxury and corrupts manners and morals, but diminishes the activity of the capital and the industry of the country. In all the great places that are now in a state of decay, we find families living on the interest of money that formerly were engaged in manufactures or commerce. Antwerp, Genoa, and Venice were full of such, but those persons would not have ventured a single shilling in a new enterprise. The connection between industry and revenue was lost in their ideas. They knew nothing of it, and the remnants of the industrious, who still cultivated the ancient modes of procuring wealth, were considered as an inferior class of persons, depending upon less certain means of existence, and generally greatly straitened for capital, which, as soon as they possessed in sufficient quantity, enabled them to follow the same example, and to retire to the less affluent, but more esteemed and idle practice of living upon interest. In countries where there are nobility, the capital of the commercial world is constantly going to them, either by marriage of daughters or by the other means which rich people take to become noble. Even where there are no nobility, the class of citizens living without any immediate connection with trade consider themselves as forming the highest order of society, and they become the envy of the others. There appears to be no means of preventing capital, when unequally divided, from being invested in the least profitable way that produces revenue. When more equally divided, it is employed in the way that produces the greatest possible income, by setting to work and maintaining the greatest possible quantity of labor. If there is not sufficient means of employing capital within a nation or country that has a very unequal division of wealth, there are plenty of opportunities furnished by poorer nations. Accordingly, every one of the nations, states, or towns that has ever been wealthy has furnished those who wanted it with capital at a low interest. Amsterdam has lent great sums to England, to Russia, and France. The French owed a very large sum to Genoa at the beginning of the Revolution. Antwerp, Cologne, and every one of the ancient, rich, and decayed towns had vested money in the hands of foreign nations, or lent to German princes, or to the great proprietors of land, on the security of their estates. The American funds found purchasers amongst the wealthy all over Europe when they could not find any in their own states, and it is probable that the far greater portion of their debt is at this time in the hands of foreigners. Thus it is that wealthy nations let the means by which the wealth was acquired go out of their hands. Each individual in a new state or in an old follows his own interest and disposition in the disposal of his property. In the new state, the individual interest and that of the country are generally the same. In the old one, they are in opposition to each other, and that opposition is greatly increased by the unequal division of property. The middling class of proprietors never seek the most profitable employment for their money. The very wealthy are always inclined to seek for good security and certain payment, without any consideration of the interest of their country. To counteract the tendency of property to accumulate, without infringing on the rights of individuals, will be found desirable. In the fourth book, a mode of doing this shall be attentively taken into consideration.
Chapter 6.
It has already been mentioned, and we have seen, in the case of Rome and Italy, that the country which was sufficient to maintain a certain population when the manners of the people were simple becomes incapable of doing so when wealth has introduced luxury. The case of the Romans, though the most clearly ascertained of any, and the circumstances the best known, is only in part applicable to an inquiry into the effects of luxury at the present day. The nature of luxury, the nature of the wants of man, and the diffusion of that luxury, its distribution amongst the different classes, are so unlike to what they were, that the comparison scarcely holds in any single instance. A most enormous increase of population, a forced population as it were, in a small country, together with large tracts of land converted from agriculture to the purposes of pleasure, were the principal causes why Italy, in latter times, was incapable of supplying itself with corn. Wherever wealth comes in more easily and in abundance, by other means than by agriculture, that is to a certain degree neglected. To cultivate ceases to be an object where it is more easy to purchase. This certainly is, at all times and in all places, one of the consequences of an influx of wealth from wheresoever it comes, or by whatever means it is acquired, though in Italy it was felt more than perhaps in any other part of the world. The manner in which wealth comes into a nation has a great effect on the consumption of produce, owing to the description of persons into whose hands it first comes. In Rome, the wealth came into the hands of the great. The slaves and servants, though more numerous, were perhaps fed in the same manner with the slaves in earlier periods, though probably not with so much economy. In a manufacturing country, the greatest part of the wealth comes first into the hands of the laboring people, who then live better and consume more of the produce of the earth, not by eating a greater quantity, but by eating of a different quality. In every manufacturing or commercial country, wealth displays itself in general opulence amongst the lower orders, and the means of supplying that greater consumption is the same as it was in Rome. The money that arrives from other countries enables the community to purchase from other countries the deficiency of provisions, and prevents the evil effects from being felt at the moment. When, in course of time, there comes to be a difficulty of obtaining the supply, from the want of produce in the country itself, then the decline begins, and as no wealth arising either from conquest, colonies, or commerce bears any great proportion to the daily food of a people, its effect is soon felt in a very ruinous and terrible manner. England is the greatest country for extensive commerce that ever existed, yet the amount of the whole of its foreign trade would not do much more than furnish the people with bread, and certainly not with all the simple necessaries of life. If, therefore, a country, such as this is, were unable to furnish itself with the necessaries of life, the whole balance of trade now in its favor would not be sufficient to supply any considerable deficiency. The desire of eating animal food in place of vegetables is very general, and amongst a people living by manufactures will always be indulged. If the country was fully peopled before animal food was so much used, that is, if the population was as great as the vegetable produce of the country was able to supply, as the same quantity of ground cannot feed the same number of people with animal food, there will be a necessity of importing the deficiency. The change that this produces, when once it begins to operate, is a most powerful and effectual cause of decline, and without the intervention of conquest or any violent revolution, would of itself be sufficient to impoverish, in the first instance, and, in the second, to depopulate a country. We find every country that was once wealthy, but that has fallen into decline, is thinly peopled. And if it were not for the want of information, from which the cause may be traced, a deficiency of food might most probably be found to be one of the most efficient. Flanders, which is one of the most fertile countries in Europe and has experienced a partial decline, is probably not near so fully peopled as it once was. Its present population would not support those armies or give it that rank amongst nations which it at one time maintained. It is true there have been persecutions and emigrations, which must have reduced the population of the country for a time, but not to an extent that would account for such a diminution in its numbers, as there is reason to think has taken place. Ghent, a town of an amazing size, could at one time send out 50,000 fighting men. It certainly could not now, that is to say, at the time the French subdued the country, have furnished 1/4 part of the number. Ghent is not the only town in this situation. The others have all fallen off in the same manner. When manufactures declined, the people did not go to live in the country, for that also is thinly inhabited, the richness of the soil being taken into consideration. The peasants of that country lived much better than their French neighbors. They apparently brought up their children with more ease and fed them more fully, but the country was not so populous in proportion to its fertility. In southern climates, where the heat of the sun is great and vegetation difficult, unless the crop is of a nature to protect the ground from its effects, natural grass is never luxuriant, and the cattle are neither so large nor so fat as in more northerly latitudes. Corn, on the other hand, which rises to a sufficient height before the hot season to protect the ground from the rays of the sun, is a more profitable crop, and indeed, the only one that could, potatoes excepted, support a great population. In such countries, scarcely any degree of general affluence would enable the laboring classes to eat animal food. No degree of wealth that can well be supposed would enable the inhabitants of the southern parts of France or of Spain to live on butcher meat, which, if it became to be in general demand, would be dearer than poultry, or even than game. The absolute necessity of living on vegetables, or rather the absolute impossibility of contracting a habit of living on animal food, must then, in those countries, counteract the taste and prevent depopulation being produced by that cause. But it is very different with more northerly countries, where it is almost a matter of indifference, in point of expense, to an individual who enjoys any degree of affluence, whether he lives on vegetable or animal food, and where he gives a decided preference to the former. It is probable that nature, so admirable in adapting the manners of the inhabitants to the nature of the country, has made heavy animal food less congenial to the taste of southern nations than to those of the north. There is indeed reason to believe it is so, but, whether it is or not, as natural philosophy is not here the study, but political economy, the fact is that if southern nations had the same propensity, it would be impossible to indulge it to an equal extent. As wealth and power are intimately connected with population, and depend in a great measure upon it, Wherever they are, the cause of introducing a taste that will, in the end, depopulate a country, they must, in so far, undermine their own support and bring on decay. This is a case that applies to all northern nations, and particularly to Britain. In order, therefore, to treat the subject at full length, it will be better to enter into the minute examination when we come to apply the case directly to this country and seek for a remedy. Though this cause of depopulation, arising from wealth, increasing the consumption of food, is peculiar to northern nations, yet there are others that have a similar effect, that fall more heavily on the inhabitants of the South. Rest from labor is, in warm climates, a great propensity and easily indulged. In no northern nation could there be found so idle a set of beings as the Lazzaroni of Naples. If the nations of the North have a desire to indulge themselves in consuming more, those of the South have a propensity to be idle and produce less, the effect of which is in nearly the same, for whether they produce anything or not, they must consume something. The same listlessness and desire of rest that produces idleness and beggary amongst the poor makes the rich inclined to have a great retinue of servants, and as those servants are idly inclined, they serve for low wages, on condition of having but light work to perform. Thus it is that the fertility of the soil and the other natural advantages are destroyed by the disposition of the inhabitants. It does not appear, however, that this disposition was indulged or encouraged to any hurtful extent, until wealth had vitiated the original manners of the inhabitants. The Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, all of them performed works requiring great exertion. They encouraged industry and arts, and became great, wealthy, and populous. But when once they fell to decline, the same fate attended the descendants of them all. Of all the countries that were once great and have fallen to decay, Italy has retained its population the best. But for this, there is an evident cause to be found in the natural fertility of the country, and the resource still drawn from foreigners who have never ceased to visit that once famous seat of arts and military glory. The number of horses and of domestic animals maintained by the fruits of the earth, but producing nothing, as they increase in every country where wealth prevails, may be considered as a cause of depopulation confined to no part of the world. Thus we find either the same cause acting throughout, or different causes producing the same effect in different countries, thereby reducing them all much more nearly to an equality than we could at first imagine. It has been observed that when wealth comes to the working orders and makes them indulge in animal food, it produces a greater effect with respect to the consumption of produce than if the same wealth came into the hands of the rich. This is, however, in some degree, compensated by their not keeping pleasure horses, the greatest of all consumers of the produce of the earth. One horse will consume as much as a family of 4 persons living on corn and the ordinary vegetables used in England, and as much as 2 families living as they do in Ireland or Scotland on oatmeal, milk, and potatoes. As we find depopulation one of the effects that is universally occasioned by decline, it must originate in some cause equally general, and that cause must be one attending the state of wealth and greatness, for it does not appear to be a necessary effect of decline. We can very easily conceive a people, degraded and numerous, reduced to live poorly, as they do in Naples, Cairo, and some other particular spots. But taking the whole of those countries together, we find evident marks of a falling off in population, and we find it not progressive, but of long standing. Those countries seem to have found a new maximum of population, far inferior to the former standard, immediately after they ceased to be wealthy and flourishing. Perhaps it was from this cause that the idea of sumptuary laws originated. For though, in some cases, the pride of being distinguished might occasion the sovereign to enact, or the higher orders of society to solicit them, yet they were always considered as tending to prevent ruinous extravagance. When states become very wealthy, they may consider such regulations as ridiculous, and perhaps they may neither be necessary nor effectual, yet nevertheless, there must be some cause for the general opinion of their utility. Though it is not the fashion of the present times to hold an opinion as good because it is general, and its prevalence in ignorant times is considered as a mark of its being erroneous. Yet, observation and common sense have never been wanting at any period, and it is from those sources that such maxims and opinions arise. Any man who had traveled, first through Italy and Spain, and then through England and America, would be very likely to invent sumptuary laws if he had never heard of such a thing before. In the application of sumptuary laws, as a device for preventing decline, the traveler might perhaps be very whimsical, sometimes forbidding what would never be attempted, but there would be nothing at all ridiculous in his general intention. It will certainly be found that in all the causes of the decay of nations, the increase of consumption and decrease of production takes the greatest variety of forms and disguises itself the most. It is, therefore, one that is much to be guarded against, particularly as its effects seem to be difficult to remedy. As the manner in which a country acquires riches has a considerable influence on the habits of the people, a country acquiring riches by conquest or colonies must naturally expend it in splendor and magnificence. Merchants are less splendid than conquerors and planters. Their ostentation is of a different sort, and as the fortunes made in that way are rather more equally divided, they cannot launch out quite so far. Besides, merchants are seldom entirely independent of credit and industry. At least when acquiring their fortunes they were not so, and therefore, whether the necessity continues or not, the habit, once contracted, is never quite effaced. Manufacturers, again, are still less splendid than merchants. With them, the gifts of fortune are more equally divided than with either of the other three, and they seldom arrive at more than an ordinary degree of affluence, which affords the means of gratifying personal wants, of living with hospitality, ease, and comfort. The greatest part of manufacturing wealth, and that indeed is divided with a pretty equal hand, is that which goes to the working people, who spend nearly the whole on personal enjoyment. The quantity of food that an individual may consume is nearly limited by nature, but the extent of ground on which that food grows depends chiefly on the quality. Thus, for example, it will require nearly 10 times the number of acres to maintain 100 people who live on animal food that it would require to supply the same persons living on vegetables. And as wealth increases, animal food always obtains the preference. This is evident from so many proofs that it scarcely needs illustration. In London, which is the most wealthy part of England, there is more animal food consumed than in any other part in proportion to the numbers, and in the country there is always less than in the towns. In the country and in the towns of England, there is more than in any proportional part of Scotland, or in France, or indeed any part of Europe. Expensive as animal food is here, still it bears less proportion to the wages of labor or the general wealth than in any other country. In every country, as riches have increased, the consumption of the produce of the earth has augmented. The Dutch seem to have been well aware of the danger of wealth making the people consume too much. A man in moderate circumstances loses his credit there, who roasts his meat instead of boiling it. It is reckoned wastefulness, and, as such, is the occasion of confidence being withdrawn from him. It has nearly as bad an effect on a man's credit as if he were seen coming from a gaming house. It will perhaps be said that the parsimony of the Dutch is ridiculous, but we ought not to attribute this merely to parsimony, but to a feeling similar to what we have very properly in England when we see bread wasted. It arises from a feeling of the general want, not of the particular loss, which is totally a different thing. If a man give away imprudently, that loss is to himself, not to the community. As there cannot be givers without receivers, it is a change of hands, but there ends the matter. A habit of wasting is another thing. It is a general loss, and therefore hurts the community at large as well as the individual. When this augmented consumption takes place to any great extent, it is the infallible cause of depopulation. How nearly depopulation and decline are connected with each other is very easily and well understood. Indeed, it is impossible not to see their intimate connection. While the exports of a country amount to a great sum, a few millions can be spared for the importation of provisions without any great difficulty, but the evil may increase imperceptibly till it becomes impossible to remedy it. The distress that must be occasioned in such a case is beyond the power of calculation. For though, In times of plenty, animal food is preferred. Whenever there comes anything like want, that can only be supplied by corn, and there is no wealth sufficient in any country to procure that for a number of years, to any great extent. It is calculated by the author of the notes on Dr. Smith's inquiry into the wealth of nations that if the supply of corn were to fall short, 1/4 part in England, for a number of years running, there would be no means of finding either corn to buy, ships to transport it, or money to pay for it, without totally deranging the commerce of the country. In every country, there are a number of persons who can afford to live in a more expensive way than the rest. Perhaps this may be reckoned at 1/4, but in countries that are poor, even that fourth cannot afford to eat animal food. If, however, a country becomes sufficiently rich for 1/6 to live chiefly on animal food, and the other 5/6 to live one day in the week on that food, the effect will be as if 1/3 lived on it constantly, which would require 2/3 more territory than when the whole lived on bread. Those who think that such matters find their own level and regulate themselves may be right in the long run, for so they indeed do. But how? When poverty and want came, no doubt the consumption of flesh meat would be diminished. When the country had no means of supplying itself as it did when it was rich, famine would play its part in becoming one of the regulators. But before this regulation could be effected, the evil we wish to prevent would have taken place. The country would be depopulated and ruined. We must, therefore, in trying to avert the decline of a nation, not set anything down for the counteracting and adjusting power, which is known sometimes to interfere so very advantageously in the affairs of men. Though it is true that it does interfere, it is in all cases of this sort too late. It is an effect of the cause which we wish to avoid. We can only look to it here for stopping the career and process of time, but never for preventing it. We know that the extravagance of an individual impairs his fortune, and that the diminution of means will at length counteract the extravagance, but then it will do so when it is too late and after he is ruined. Wastefulness may be stopped, but it cannot possibly stop itself, as the diminution of means is the cause of the extravagance ceasing, and itself is an effect of the prior existence of the extravagance. Regarding men merely then as producing and consuming, the proportion between which regulates the wealth of a nation, we find that, in their own persons, there is a rooted tendency to bring on the decline. But we shall farther find that not only do people in wealthy and luxurious nations produce less and consume more than in nations less advanced, but they increase the number of unproductive laborers, all of whom consume without producing. They also maintain animals who consume, but do nothing towards production. No country in which the people live much upon animal food can be well peopled. 200 persons to a square mile of country is nearly the highest population of any nation in Europe. That is, as near as may be, 3 acres and a quarter to each person. But on an average, even in France, there are more than 4 acres to each. Supposing that 1/2 of the land is cultivated, then that gives about 2 acres to each person. Supposing again that 1/3 of this is consumed by horses or other animals who labor, or supposing that they do not serve for the food of man, then there will be nearly about 1 acre and a quarter for the maintenance of each person. It will, however, only require 1/2 an acre to one person if they all lived on field vegetables, and if they all lived on fresh meat, it would require 4 acres. The natural conclusion is that 1/4 live on animal food, and the other 3/4 on vegetables, or what is the same thing, that the proportions of the two sorts of food are as 1 to 3. According to the proportion of the prices in France of 4 to 1, it would certainly cost double the price to live on animal food that it does on vegetables. That is to say, if the only vegetable was bread, supposing which is the case, that 1 pound of meat supplies the place of 2 pounds of bread, as it certainly does. In England, where beef is only twice the price of bread, it is almost a matter of indifference as to price, whether a working man lives on vegetables or animal food. To the taste and the stomach, however, it is no matter of indifference. The animal food, therefore, is preferred. But if it were a matter of some importance in point of economy, That would not prevent the people of a country, flourishing by manufactures, from eating it, and thereby at length sinking to a lower degree of population than a poor country living on vegetable food. In all nations getting wealthy, this is a consideration, but most so when the wealth is acquired by manufactures, when the lower and numerous class have an opportunity of gratifying themselves by indulging in the species of food which they find the most agreeable. This, like the other changes of manners, of which it is only a part, is a natural consequence of a propensity inherent in human nature. It cannot therefore be prevented or done away, though it may to a certain degree be counteracted. The manner of counteracting it not being a general manner, but depending on circumstances, shall be treated of when investigating the increasing danger arising from this cause in the English nation. It remains at present for us to examine another evil attendant on the inadequacy of the soil to supply the consumption of a country. One of the most alarming circumstances attendant on this situation of things is that provisions become an object of monopoly, and the most dangerous and destructive of all objects. The law has interfered in regulating the interest of money, but not in the rent of houses or of other use of property. Circumstances may occur in which the necessity of procuring a loan of money is so great as to induce the borrower to engage to pay an interest that would be ruinous to himself, and that would grant the lender the means of extortion or of obtaining exorbitant profit. The same interference would be just as reasonable wherever the same sort of necessity, by existing, puts one man in the power of another. This is the case with every necessary article of provision, which indeed may be considered as all one article, for the price of one is connected with the prices of all the others. Provisions, indeed, are, in general, articles that cannot be preserved for any very great length of time. But then, again, they are articles of a nature that the consumers must have within a limited time also, and for which they are inclined to give an exorbitant price rather than not to have. The interference of the law between a man and the use of his property ought to be as seldom as possible, but it has never been maintained as a general principle that it ought never to interfere. If it is at any time, or in any case, right to interfere legally, the question of when it is to be done becomes merely one of expediency, one of circumstance, but not one that admits of a general decision. A writer of great and deservedly great reputation has said so much on this subject, and treated it in a way that both reason and experience prove to be wrong, that it has become indispensably necessary to argue the point. Monopoly, regrading, and forestalling, which two last are only particular modes of monopolizing, have been considered as chimeras, as imaginary practices that have never existed, and that cannot possibly exist. They have been likewise assimilated to witchcraft, an ideal belief arising in the times of ignorance. It has now become the creed of legislators and ministers that trade should be left to regulate itself, that monopoly cannot exist. With all the respect justly due to the learned writer who advanced so bold an opinion, it may be asked, since many instances occur, both in sacred and profane history, in ancient times, and in our own days, of provisions, on particular occasions, selling at 100 times their natural price, and every price above the natural one is called a monopoly price, how can it be asserted that they may not become an object of monopoly in a more general way, though not at so exorbitant a price? How, it may be asked, can this thing that has so often occurred in an extreme degree, a thing that is allowed to be possible, be compared with the miraculous effect of witchcraft, of the existence of which there does not appear to be one authentic record? The one, at all events, a natural, and the other a supernatural effect. How are those to be admitted in fair comparison? If we know that, at the siege of Mantua, the provisions rose to 100 times their usual price, we may believe the same thing possible at the siege of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and at the siege of Leyden, or at that of Paris. If we know that a guinea is given for a bad dinner at an inn which is not worth a shilling, merely because some particular circumstance has drawn more people together than can be provided for, and because hunger admits not patiently of delay, can we dispute the inclination to extortion on the one hand and the disposition to submit to it on the other? If that is admitted, the interference of the law is allowable on the same principle on which it regulates the interest of money, though not to the same extent. That is, it is allowable in particular instances where the effects are similar, but not in all instances, because in all instances they are not similar. The rate of provisions is then liable, on particular occasions, to rise to a monopoly price, such as that of those rare productions of nature, the quantity of which cannot be increased, whatever the demand may be. It follows, as an evident consequence, that the price increases as the scarcity augments. But if it only did so, the evil would not be so great as it really is. In the first place, the anxiety attendant on the risk of wanting so necessary an article creates a greater competition amongst buyers than the degree of scarcity would occasion in an article of less necessity and importance. In a wealthy nation, the evil is still farther increased by two other causes: the high price which one part of the society is able to afford, and the wealth of those who sell enables them to keep back the provisions from the market. The first cause operates in all countries nearly alike, for the anxiety to have food is nearly equal all the world over. But the last two operate more or less according to the wealth of the buyers and of the sellers, as the eagerness and ability of the former to purchase and the interest and ability of the latter to keep back from selling are regulated by the degree of wealth in a country. When the necessaries of life become dear and arrive at a monopoly price, then all taxes and other burthens laid on the people become a matter comparatively of little importance. In England, where the taxes are higher than in any nation in the world, they do not come on the poor to above £3 a head, and of those, at least one half can be avoided by a little self-denial. But when the provisions increase one half in price, it amounts to at least £4 a head to each person, so that the effect falls on the population of the country with a most extraordinary degree of severity. But great as this evil is, it has, by the circumstances and nature of things, a tendency to increase the very cause in which it originates. Though the highness of price diminishes the consumption of victuals in general, it diminishes the consumption of vegetable food, or bread, more than it does that of animal food. Though all sorts of eatables rise in price in times of scarcity, yet bread, being the article that excites the greatest anxiety, rises higher in proportion than the others. This affords an encouragement to gratify the propensity for eating animal food, and this propensity is encouraged by an absurd and mistaken policy, by which, or perhaps rather an affectation of policy, economy in bread is prescribed, and not in other food, so that when people devour animal food and increase the evil, they think they are most patriotically and humanely diminishing it. The danger of wanting food, though very formidable, does not act so instantaneously as to serve as an excuse for want of reflection, like an alarm of fire, where the anxiety to escape sometimes prevents the possibility of doing so. Yet the fact is that all the measures that have generally been taken in times of scarcity have tended rather to increase than to diminish the evil. In monopoly, a sort of combination is supposed to exist between the sellers of an article, when the article does not happen to be all in the hands of one person or one body of persons. But combinations are of various sorts. There are express combinations entered into by people having the same interest for a particular purpose. Those are done by a sort of an agreement, when the interest of the individual and of the body are the same. Such combinations are generally effectual, but unlawful. There are combinations not less effectual, that arise merely from circulating intelligence of prices, and certain circumstances on which prices are known to depend, amongst all those concerned, who immediately know how to act in unison. This is not unlawful. An elegant historian has said that there was a time when the sovereign pontiff, like the leader of a band of musicians, could regulate all the clergy in Europe, so that the same tones should proceed from all the pulpits on the same day. The list of prices at a great corn market has the same effect on the minds of all the sellers within a certain distance. Intelligence now flies so swift that there is no interval of uncertainty. The whole of the dealers know how to act according to circumstances, and they are all led to act nearly as if they were in one single body. Like gamesters who have won a great deal, rather than hasten to sell, Even when they fear that prices may fall, they keep back their stock and risk to lose something of what they have gained by continuing to speculate on the agreeable and winning chance by which they have already profited. The dealers in an article of ready sale, or for which there is a certain demand, have never any difficulty in a wealthy country of procuring money to make purchases or to enable them to keep their stock, and the gains are so immense that there is no speculation equally attractive. As the rent of land in England is reckoned at 25 millions a year, and it is reckoned that, in a common year, the rent is worth 1/3 of the produce, it follows that of all sorts of produce of land, the value is 75 millions. But in the year 1799, when the prices were more than doubled, the value was 150 millions, of which the landlord received, as usual, 25 to his share, leaving for the farmer, etc., 125, instead of 50, the usual sum. As the wages of servants remained the same, and in an ordinary year would amount to 1/3 of the rent, 8 millions went for that, leaving 117 millions in place of 42, the usual residue. 2/3 of the value of rent, or 16 millions, is, in an ordinary year, supposed to go for seed, the maintenance of cattle, and laborers, so that in that year the portion so consumed must be estimated at double value, or 34 millions, which, deducted from 117, leaves 83 for the farmers in place of 25 in an ordinary year, so that, when the price doubles, the farmer's profit does more than triple. In the year 1799, the farmers were known to have the profit of 4 ordinary years, supposing that they had been the actual sellers in the market. The fact was otherwise no doubt, with regard to those who pocketed the profit, which went in part only to farmers, and the rest went to the monopolists, dealers, regraders, forestallers, etc., who advanced money to keep up the price. To the public who paid, the matter is the same, and to the business itself there is little difference as to who profited or who found capital. For, as they shared the profit amongst them, and as they received 3 times as much as in an ordinary year, they could, out of the sales of the first 4 or 5 months, make all the payments for the whole year to the landlord, and therefore could have the means of keeping the remainder, just as long as they thought proper. Thus, then, while there is any degree of scarcity, the provisions of a country are at a monopoly price, and the dealers act, though individually, as if they enjoyed one general monopoly. Before leaving his important subject, it is necessary to observe that, though dealers in provisions, in times of any degree of scarcity, that is, when there is not quite enough fully to supply the consumption of the country, act in keeping up prices as if they had an exclusive privilege for monopoly, yet that is the only cases in which they do so. A single monopolizer can diminish the quantity, and perhaps destroy a part of it with advantage to himself. Thus, the Dutch East India Company were said to have done with the spices. But the individual dealer, though he is interested in a general high price and monopoly, is still more interested in selling as much as he can, and the higher the price, the more careful he is not to waste or consume more than he can help. In this respect, the monopoly of the many is not half so hurtful as the individual monopoly. This proves that all the vulgar errors, which occasion reports of farmers and dealers destroying their corn, are not only without foundation, but would produce an effect quite contrary to the avaricious principle by which such men are considered as being governed. Monopoly of this sort, by raising the prices of the necessaries of life, in the end augments the prices of labor, the rent of land, and the taxes of a country. We have already examined the tendency of all this. It is only necessary to observe that the rise in prices or depreciation of money, which other causes bring on by degrees, this brings on violently and suddenly. This cause will always exist in a country that cannot provide enough for its own subsistence. How far this may go, it is not easy to say, for if it is clear that the farmer, by double prices, gets £83 in place of 25, he can certainly afford to give his landlord something more. If he gave him double the usual rent, it would still leave more than double for himself. Of all the causes, then, that hasten the crisis of a country, none is equal to that of the produce becoming unequal to the maintenance of the inhabitants, for it is only in that case that the effects of monopoly are to be dreaded. In the case of animal food becoming too much in request, there is a remedy which may be easily applied, of which it will be our purpose to speak, in treating of the application of the present inquiry to the advantage of the British dominions.
This concludes today's reading of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.